In 1951, 9-year-old Linda Brown was denied entrance to an all-white elementary school in Topeka, Kansas. What ensued was a 3-year-long class action lawsuit that made it all the way to the Supreme Court. The ruling changed the political climate of the United States forever. Today, we will discuss the details of the case Brown v. Board of Education and why it was significant. This case is probably somewhat familiar for most of us. We have all sat in government classes and probably heard the names Linda Brown or Thurgood Marshall. Because I am interested in the U.S. legal system, I researched this case further. As Americans, we are all called to be good citizens, and that requires a thorough understanding of how our government works. Brown v. Board of Education is a great case to study to gain a better understanding of our judicial system. In order to understand why this case was so significant, we first need to understand how our judicial system relies on precedents. I'll begin by discussing Plessy v. Ferguson, the precedent case. According to Cornell Law School, precedent is a court case that takes authority when deciding a ruling for a similar case. Precedent is part of our stare decisis doctrine and requires the court to use past cases as guidelines for deciding rulings. In Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, a man who was only 1/8 black was prohibited from sitting in an all-white railway car. The case deals with Section 1 of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, which states that all citizens should receive equal protection of the law. Plessy argued that segregation denied black citizens equal protection. According to the National Archive, the Supreme Court ruled that as long as the facilities for both races were equal, they could remain segregated. The Legal Information Institute states that this ruling established separate but equal doctrine, which ruled American politics for years. Separate but equal doctrine was the justification for Jim Crow laws and the institution of segregation. Because of this ruling, plaintiffs that similarly used the Equal Protection Clause as the basis for their case were not successful because the Supreme Court upheld the ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson. This created a challenge for the Brown v. Board of Education case. They would have to overrule the Plessy decision and, therefore, overrule separate but equal doctrine. Now that we understand the challenge for this case, let's discuss the case itself. According to the History Channel, the Brown v. Board of Education case started in 1951 when Linda Brown was denied entrance to an all-white school. Brown used the Equal Protection Clause as the base for the case. They argued that colored and white schools were not equal, and therefore Linda was being denied equal protection of the law. White schools had better facilities and books and received more funding from the state. 13 plaintiffs joined the class action law school, according to the Brown Foundation. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People joined the case also. Sometimes, in court cases, an interest group will help fund the cost of the case. These interest groups can be very important in the success or failure of cases. The NAACP had been trying cases similar to Brown since 1935 and had seen some success with private institutions. Most of the cases they tried pertained to graduate and secondary school, according to the National Archive. They did this because they believed it would be easy to argue that students did not receive equal training in white and colored law schools. Thurgood Marshall, who had been named special counsel for the NAACP in 1939, became the chief attorney on the case when it was tried in the Supreme Court. He would later be appointed the first black Supreme Court justice by President Lyndon B. Johnson. Brown made it to the Supreme Court in 1952. According to the History Channel, the judges were divided on how to rule on the case. At the time, Fred M. Vinson was the Chief Justice, and he believed that the Plessy verdict should not be overturned. Before the case was to be heard, Vinson died and was replaced by President Eisenhower by former Governor of California, Earl Warren. In 1954, Warren ruled in the plaintiffs' favor, stating that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. He stated that segregation was inherently unequal, and therefore Linda Brown was being denied equal protection of the law. The Brown ruling is still relevant today. According to the National Archive, the Supreme Court anticipated opposition to the Brown ruling. Because of this, they gave no immediate direction on how schools should be desegregated. They instead asked attorney generals of states with segregation laws to come up with their own plans. However, in 1955, the Supreme Court created their own plan for desegregating the schools. They called this plan Brown 2 and stated that it was to be carried out with all deliberate speed. This case illustrates one of the weaknesses of our judicial system. Because the Supreme Court has no way to enforce their rulings, they must rely on the bureaucracy of national and state governments. Because of this, it took years for schools to be fully desegregated. By 1960, less than 1% of black students in Arkansas attended integrated schools, according to the Equal Justice Initiative. Nonetheless, schools were eventually desegregated, but schools weren't the only institutions affected by the Brown decision. The Brown ruling attacked all separate but equal doctrine, and changed desegregation in the U.S. and changed American politics forever. In conclusion, Brown v. Board of Education was a landmark case that perfectly showcases the judicial process. Brown v. Board of Education illustrates the importance of how interest groups can be used in cases, and also how the United States uses precedents to determine rulings in legal cases. The Brown v. Board of Education changed American politics forever.